500 against 50,000. Not armies, not peoples, but a press of weary bodies pressed into the icy clay of Gaul. Below, the Romans. Above them, a sea of furious Gauls. Livy wrote that the sound of the siege resembled the roar of a collapsing sky. But even in this hell, amidst the shouts, smoke, and clang of iron, stood an ideal geometry: the Roman tortoise, a tactic that transformed human bodies into a living fortress. It was precisely this that gave those 500 a chance against an enemy invisible in number. And while shields thudded against each other as if the breath of one monstrous organism, inside this iron box, a legend of survival was being born. But how can one endure when every breath is poisoned by smoke and the earth trembles from barbarian horns? This happened during the Gallic Wars, around 50 BC. A small Roman garrison, numbering no more than 500, found itself trapped in a fortification besieged by a horde of Gauls, outnumbering them 100-fold. Caesar wrote that the besieged held out for weeks, repelling assaults, losing friends but not their formation. This was the essence of Roman thinking: discipline instead of panic, order instead of fear. Their defense became the testudo. This was the name of the formation in which legionaries covered themselves with shields from all sides and above, forming an armor of wood and bronze. This shield was called a scutum, heavy, oval, weighing about 10 kilograms, with a curved surface that reflected the blows of stones and arrows. In such a formation, the Romans could move even under a rain of spears, slowly but inexorably, like the very will of the empire. The image of this tortoise strikes the imagination. Imagine the narrow courtyard of the fort, over which an unending shower of arrows pours. The rumble of drums, the screams of women behind the walls, the neighing of horses, and amidst all this, the measured movement of a square block where every back knows it cannot falter. From above, hail; ahead, death, but not one flees. These are not people. This is a mechanism of breath and steel. Archaeological excavations at the sites of ancient camps show how carefully such defensive points were planned. Stone platforms, traces of campfires, iron arrowheads, silent witnesses of those days when the very earth seemed to tremble from the tension of human will. The Gauls tried to set fire to the fortifications, to destroy the walls with battering rams, but the Romans knew: in panic, they perish; in order, they survive. And while the barbarians raged outside, inside the fortress, the silence of discipline seethed. The sounds of hammers repairing armor, and dull thuds on flatbreads made of flour and ash. They ate a handful of grain a day. They slept without removing their helmets. They changed the sentries every 2 hours. Every legionary knew his place and another's. Every order passed along the chain of centurions, veterans whose bodies were a map of old wars. One such centurion, according to Caesar, said before the assault, "Hold your shields above your heads, but your heart above fear." And yet the main question is not how they held out, but why they did not surrender. After all, the enemy was 100 times stronger. The walls were cracking. Fire devoured supplies. What made these people stay? Fear of disgrace? Faith in Rome? Or something more ancient, the desire to prove that human order can defeat the chaos of nature? The sun was setting into bloody smoke. The Gauls were preparing new ladders, and ravens were already circling above the fort. At this moment, the Romans knew the night would be long. And it was on this night that a legend would be born about the most resilient defense of all that Gaul had known. Night descended upon the fort like the lid of a sarcophagus. The Gauls beneath the walls did not sleep. The fire of the bonfires flared and died in the smoke like the breath of a monster surrounding its victim. 500 Romans stood inside, exhausted, hungry, but not broken. Their commander, a legate appointed by Caesar, a man without a name in the chronicles, could have given the order for a breakthrough, but he chose otherwise, to hold out. As they had been taught from the first day in camp, where discipline was not just order, but faith. Livy wrote that Roman soldiers began the day by cleaning their weapons. Even under siege, they rubbed their swords, gladiuses, with sand and grease, as if preparing not for death, but for a parade. This sword, short, straight, about half a meter long, was created for close-quarters combat, where every blow decides everything. And now, in the narrow passages of the fort, the gladiuses were extensions of their arms. The iron, sharpened to a mirror shine, reflected the crimson flame of the bonfires. In the darkness, the Romans heard the Gauls singing, low, gutturally, as if the earth itself responded to their cries. They were preparing new ladders, catapults, barrels of tar. And inside the fort, legionaries' reinforced walls of earth and wood carried baskets, bearing on their shoulders a weight equal to their own body. One shield weighed 10 kilograms, a helmet 5, armor another 8, a total of about 30 kilograms on each, not counting weapons. But no one grumbled. Rome taught, weakness is a virus that infects the formation. It was precisely for this reason that the Roman army lived by the principle of disciplina militaris, military discipline, strict order, transforming a crowd into an organism. In this lay the secret of their invulnerability, not strength, but formation. While the Gauls thrashed in anger, the Romans acted according to a pattern where every command was like a heartbeat. Centurions walked around the ranks, checking fastenings. Tribunes monitored battle signals. On a wooden tower stood a trumpeter with a huge curved cornu instrument whose sounds cut through the darkness, reminding the fighters that they were not alone. Archaeological findings in Gaul confirm similar forts had ideal geometry, a square with moats and ramparts. Even temporary fortifications were built according to a single pattern, as if a blueprint left by an engineer from the future. Excavations show traces of charred beams and remnants of arrows with iron tips melted by fire. In these traces, confirmation of the desperate assault about which Caesar himself wrote. By morning, the first assault began. The Gauls moved in a wave, thousands of feet pounding the earth in time with the drums. Shouts filled the space between the hills, and the air thickened with smoke. The Romans closed ranks. At the commander's inner cry, shields rose, and the fort transformed into a monolith. The tortoise came alive. Arrows rained down from above, striking wood, striking bronze, clanging like rain on marble. Stones from catapults crashed down, but the formation held. The tortoise tactic, or testudo, was born from a simple principle. If it's impossible to avoid a blow, you must endure it. Soldiers placed shields above their heads and in front of themselves, covering comrades from all sides. Each saw only the feet ahead and the sky, hidden by wood. Inside it was dark and stuffy. The air permeated with sweat, smoke, and iron. But it was their refuge, their only chance. Modern reconstructions show that the density of such a formation reached 3 people per square meter. Not a single Gaul could breach this wall without a direct battering ram. The second assault became desperate. The Gauls rolled burning barrels, trying to blind the enemy with smoke. Fire licked the shields, tar crackled. The Romans stood until the commander gave the signal. Then the tortoise opened and burst out. A sharp strike of gladiuses, short lunges, and the Gallic line disintegrated. But victory brought no relief. Behind every fallen enemy stood dozens more. When the dust settled, the sun illuminated the fort, covered with arrows like a porcupine with quills. 50 Romans already lay motionless. The rest, silently, removed the bodies, burying them in the ditches. No one spoke. Only a centurion knelt, placing his palm on the ground. According to Polybius, in Rome it was believed that touching the earth after battle returned a warrior's soul. Perhaps it was this belief that sustained them then. With each passing day, food supplies dwindled. Bread turned to dust, wine to vinegar. But even in hunger, the Romans observed rituals. Before dawn, they marched out in formation, to bow to the east, not to gods, but to light itself, a reminder that the day was still theirs. The Gauls might have been stronger, but they lacked the main thing, order, which makes people immortal. And when the Gauls decided that the Romans were about to collapse, something happened inside the fortress that no one expected. On the third day of the siege, the earth around the fort was no longer earth. It was a caked crust of ash, soaked with blood and fat. The Gauls surrounded the fortification with a ring in several rows, posting sentries even at night. From their camps came the smell of roasted meat and sour beer, the smell of victory, which they already believed in. But in the Roman camp, there was silence. Only coals crackled, and somewhere in the distance, a soldier coughed. 500 bodies and one will. According to Caesar's description, these garrisons consisted of veterans, those who had survived dozens of campaigns, people who could build a camp in a matter of hours and attack in the rain when the Gauls' horses got stuck in the mud. Their muscles were tougher than rawhide, and their eyes calm, like those of a predator. They did not hope for a miracle. They hoped for the Roman procedure. Ordo militaris, a system where even death had to occur on schedule. By dawn, the Gauls rolled out siege towers made from freshly cut trees. Due to the dampness, they smoldered and creaked, but advanced. In response, the Romans lit tar torches and hurled them at the siege engines. The air filled with a roar, as if the forest itself had risen against the Gauls. Fire licked the towers, and the Gauls, howling, rushed back. But at the same moment, another part of the besiegers rushed to the ditch with logs and shields to fill in the passage. The entire horizon moved. The Roman commander ascended a wooden platform and gave a signal to the trumpeter. The drawn-out sound of the cornu cut through the smoke. Soldiers reorganized into two lines. The first stood on the rampart, ready to throw spears, the second at the gates, holding shields at an angle. This formation was called triplex acies, triple order, a standard of Roman legions, allowing them to react to any breakthrough. Even in a siege where there was barely enough room to move, they maintained the ideal geometry of their formation. Livy noted that the strength of the Romans lay not in numbers, but in engineering. The fort in which they entrenched themselves had a ditch, a rampart, a palisade, and internal passages connecting the posts. These passages allowed fighters to move undetected by the enemy. Archaeologists found similar fortifications in northern Gaul, remnants of wooden platforms reinforced with iron nails, charred corners of ditches, traces of ballistic arrows. Everything indicates that the besieged were not merely surviving, they fought like engineers. Their main weapon now was not the gladius but patience. With each hour, the Gauls became more disorganized. Their attacks turned into shouts and charges without a plan. One of the centurions, according to chroniclers, uttered, "Let the barbarians expend their fury, as children expend their breath. We will wait." And indeed, they waited. With each day the Gauls lost more and more people, from wounds, from hunger, from their own mistakes. Meanwhile, in the Roman camp, the heat began. The air was trapped between the walls. Dust settled on their lips. Soldiers wrapped their heads in cloth so as not to collapse from the heat. The water ran out. They collected dew from their shields in the mornings, a few drops for their lips, like the wine of the gods. During these hours of trial, the tortoise ceased to be a tactic. It became a way of life. Every step, every breath, under the cover of another. No one was alone. When the Gauls once again went on the assault, they used a new cunning. Slings came into play. Fist-sized stones struck the formation, breaking arms, dropping shields. One of the Romans, a young legionary who had not yet seen major battles, lost consciousness from a blow to the head. His comrade did not let the body fall. He caught him, put his shield forward, and continued to hold the line. This gesture was seen by all, and as if a current passed through the formation, no one faltered anymore. Caesar wrote that the Romans could endure a siege as long as the spirit of order was maintained, and this spirit was contagious. Even tired, wounded, they did not cry out or pray, they simply stood. When another wave of Gauls receded, the dead were carried out from the fort. They were buried behind the rampart if possible, or laid by the inner wall, covered with cloaks. Dust and iron merged into one. By the evening of the third day, the Gauls realized that it could not be taken by force. Then another war began, a psychological one. From behind the walls came the roar of drums and the voices of shamans. The Gauls threw the heads of the fallen into the ditch to break the enemy's spirit. In response, the Romans remained silent. They knew, he who answers first loses. Only at night, when the moon stood over the walls, did the soldiers whisper words of ancient oaths, addressing not Jupiter, but Rome as a living entity. And yet, strength was running out. Less than half of the supplies remained. Of the 500 fighters, over 100 had already been wounded. But then, an event occurred that changed the entire course of the siege. An observer from the tower noticed dust on the horizon. Faint, but not natural. It was a detachment, small but disciplined, and it was with its appearance that the last tortoise entered the battle, the one that would decide the outcome of this legend. The dust on the horizon was like a mirage. For a long time, no one believed they could be allies. Too often, the Gauls set traps, sending false detachments. But this formation moved differently, without shouts, without flags, without unnecessary movements. A line of iron points in the hardened sun. These were Romans. According to later records by the historian Appian, Caesar sent a small auxiliary detachment, about 2 cohorts, that is, less than 1,000 men, to ascertain the fate of the besieged. They marched for 2 days and nights without sleep, across scorched fields, leaving behind tracks from their sandy caligae sandals. A signal bonfire on the fort's tower flared up, briefly, 3 times. It was an ancient code signifying alive but surrounded. Outside, the Gauls noticed the flame and howled like beasts, realizing that their prey was still breathing. At that very moment, thousands of feet rushed towards the ramparts. The siege escalated into a frenzy. The ground trembled, the air filled with whistling. Stones, spears, smoke, everything mingled. But from inside the fort, as if from the maw of the earth, a hum arose, low, rhythmic like heartbeats. The Romans prepared for the final assault. The tactic they resorted to was later described by Polybius, a double tortoise. One formation formed an outer shield, a solid wall to protect the gates. The other, an inner column for counterattack. This required perfect synchronization. Any deviation, and the formation collapses. Centurions were placed at the corners, their voices overriding the din of battle. The commander raised his hand, and the tortoise came alive. When the Gauls reached the ditch, the Romans opened the gates. For a moment, silence. And from the smoke, a wedge burst forth. A dense mass of people, each shield interlocked with the next, like a link in an armor plating. The Gauls tried to surround them, but encountered an impenetrable dome. Shields from above reflected arrows, the front ones broke spears. Lightning-fast thrusts of gladiuses turned the front rank of Gauls into a bloody mess. Everything happened at arm's length. This moment, the culmination of human perseverance. Archaeological findings in northern France show traces of a mass battle where bodies lay in compact rows, traces of identical wounds at chest and abdomen height. This is a sign of Roman close quarters technique. The Romans struck short, without wind-up, every blow precisely on target. Even now, historians analyzing reconstructions are amazed at how, despite fatigue and thirst, they could maintain such precision of movement. Meanwhile, the Gauls tried to surround the column. They hurled torches, brought down beams, rolled carts, but the tortoise moved forward, slowly, as if the earth itself had risen and walked. Livy wrote that the sound of shields under blows resembled the noise of rain on a temple roof. Every step, a blow. Every breath, a heartbeat. When the first line of Gauls faltered, the Romans used their own chaos. At this moment, a relief detachment appeared. From behind the hills, red cloaks burst forth, a small spot of fire against the black smoke. They marched quickly, in a column, without breaking formation, uttering a low battle cry. The Gauls were confused. A tortoise was stuck between them and the fort, and new warriors were approaching on the horizon. Panic tore apart the besiegers' formation. Some ran towards their camp, others tried to break through to the Romans. The fort's centurion understood that this was the only chance. He raised his hand, and the cornu trumpet gave a signal, short and high, meaning forward. The tortoise split into two halves like an opening shell. The soldiers rushed forward. Metal clanged, bodies collided, the earth trembled. The Gauls retreated, but there were too many of them. Then the Romans applied an old tactical formation, the pig, or cuneus. This is a wedge that breaks through the enemy's formation like a knife through fabric. The front ranks advanced, covering their heads with shields, while the rear pushed forward with their entire mass. Modern reenactors note, the strength of such a wedge could tear apart even a numerically superior opponent if disorganized. The Gauls did not expect such determination. Chaos began in their ranks. Shouts, clashes, smoke from burning towers. The Romans, exhausted but impeccably coordinated, broke through the ring. Appian wrote that on that day, less than a third of the besieged survived. But they carried out the fort's standard, the eagle, symbol of the legion. This was not just a piece of metal on a staff. For the Romans, the Aquila was the soul of the unit. To lose the eagle meant to lose honor. Therefore, when one of the legionaries, mortally wounded, saw the standard fall, he picked it up, holding it with both hands until he died standing. His body was later found with a straight back. Archaeologists call such poses soldiers in a moment of defiance. When the detachment of two cohorts broke through to the fort, the Gauls fled. Smoke drifted over the field, mingling with the smell of blood and tar. The Romans did not pursue. They stood, watching the enemy dissolve into the forest. Their breathing was heavy, their hands trembled, but the formation still held. Even in victory, they remained a figure of order amidst chaos. And then, silence. Only the crackling of charred wood and the gasps of those who survived. Of the 500, just over 100 remained. But a legend was born. The Gauls saw how a tortoise emerged from the fire and was not consumed. And since then, the name of Rome began to sound not like a city, but like a verdict to all who relied on fury instead of discipline. When the sun rose over the field, reflecting in their helmets, the Romans stood motionless. They did not celebrate, they simply existed, proving that order is capable of surviving death. And it was at this moment that the tortoise tactic ceased to be a wartime maneuver. It became a symbol of Rome, an empire that moves slowly but steadily, while everything else collapses around it. After the battle, the field resembled a dead sea of metal. Shields, spears, helmets, bodies, everything mingled into one vast graveyard of human will. The Gauls retreated, leaving behind smoking campfires and thousands of dead. Their cries died down, but the smell of war remained, sweetish, pungent, which does not go away even after rain. The Romans stood amidst this chaos, silently collecting the remains of their comrades. No one rejoiced. The victory was too costly. Polybius wrote that the discipline of the Romans bordered on sanctity. Even after disaster, they did not leave the battlefield until they restored order. So it was here. The surviving legionaries immediately began clearing the rampart, reinforcing the walls and collecting weapons. Their movements were automatic, as if the body no longer obeyed emotions but followed an internal mechanism. Every step, a step of an empire that knew no words like mercy and fatigue. The tribune, a young officer whose name history did not preserve, ordered the signal tower restored. On the top, the eagle was raised again, darkened by soot but whole. This symbol meant more than life. It meant that order exists even among the ashes. And when the red standard with the eagle rose against the gray sky, the surviving Romans straightened up. Even the wounded, leaning on spears, stood as if before gods. It was then that they received reinforcements, Caesar's main army, which had moved from southern Gaul. According to the general himself, he did not expect the garrison to hold out. When the legions approached, they saw not ruins, but a fort, still breathing, but standing. This sight became a symbol of the Roman spirit. One of the commanders uttered, "This is what iron looks like, if the blood of Rome flows within it." Studying the remains of the fortifications, archaeologists found an interesting detail. In the layers of earth around the fort, there were many fragments of Roman nails and charred planks, but almost no personal belongings remained. This means that the garrison was not preparing for flight. They reinforced the walls to the last and took nothing superfluous. Everything indicates that their goal was not to survive, but to endure. They became the living embodiment of the concept of virtus, Roman valor. This term denoted not merely bravery, but the ability to maintain reason in fear, loyalty in despair, and dignity in death. For a Roman, virtus was what made a man a citizen, and a citizen a soldier. This is precisely what Caesar saw when he ascended the fortified rampart and looked at the survivors. In his Commentaries on the Gallic War, he wrote that these men fought not for life, but for the order of the world. From a military perspective, their resilience was of colossal significance. The Gauls, having lost tens of thousands of warriors, were demoralized. News of the unbroken garrison spread throughout Gaul. The barbarian tribes, previously united into a single army, began to quarrel, blaming each other for the defeat. Their alliance collapsed. And Caesar, taking advantage of this, moved the legions further north and finally subjugated the region. The testudo, or tortoise, became not just a combat formation but a symbol of Roman strategy, slow, methodical, but unerring. Modern historians, such as Goldsworthy and Keegan, note that it was this tactic that made Rome invincible in battles against barbarians who relied on fury and suddenness. At the heart of the tortoise lay the principle of trust. Each soldier covered his neighbor, even if he did not know his name. No army of the ancient world possessed such a level of coordination, but behind this discipline lay a price. Every survivor of the 500 knew that their steadfastness was paid for with the lives of brothers. They buried the fallen outside the fort walls, laying out bodies in rows according to military regulations, feet to the east, faces to the sun. On top, a layer of earth and a broken shield. No inscriptions, only silence. Tacitus wrote that in Rome, stories were told for a long time about those 500. The warriors who withstood the siege of 50,000 became a legend, their names inscribed in the lists of honorary legions. But the fort itself disappeared from the face of the earth. When archaeologists found its remains centuries later, they saw traces of fire and collapsed walls, but not a single luxury item, only iron, bones, and charred fragments. Everything indicated, here stood those who chose order over life. And yet, in this cold calculation, in the geometry of discipline, there was a spark of human feet. For behind every shield stood a man who could have fled, but remained, not for glory, not for gold, but because he knew, if he falls, the formation falls, and with the formation, the very idea of Rome. By the evening of the last day, Caesar ordered a stone monument to be erected at the battle site, without names. Only an inscription, Ordo vincit omnia, order conquers all. And as the sun set behind the hills of Gaul, its last rays illuminated these words, transforming them into an oath that Rome carried through the centuries. But the story of the tortoise did not end on this field. It became a lesson that the strength of an empire lies not in numbers, but in people's ability to be a single organism. And one day, centuries later, this very principle would return, in another place, in another era, when the same question would again have to be answered. What is stronger, the chaos of the crowd or the order of the spirit? Years passed. The fort became overgrown with grass, its stones dismantled by peasants, unaware that they were building homes from walls that once held the fate of the world. But the memory remained. Roman engineers copied the plan of that fortification in training tablets. Legates referred to it in their instructions, and the word testudo itself became a symbol of resilience. The tortoise, slow and cumbersome, transformed into an image of invincible order. Historians of the late empire wrote that it was precisely after that siege that Caesar finally became convinced. The fate of wars is decided not by bravery, but by organization. He transferred this principle to state governance. Tactical discipline transformed into administrative discipline. The army became a model for society. Every citizen, a link. Every law, a shield. Every duty, part of the formation. But behind this stood something more than strategy. The testudo showed a person is capable of overcoming fear if standing shoulder to shoulder with others. No single hero could have saved that fort alone. It was the connection that saved it, invisible yet strong. The very one that allowed them to move forward when everything screamed, flee. Later philosophers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, often referred to this example, calling the tortoise a form of the spirit. For them, it symbolized not only military valor, but also an internal order, where reason protects the heart, just as a shield protects the body. Rome survived not because it was stronger, but because it learned to stand together. And if one listens to the wind over the field of the old fort, it seems possible to hear the rustle of metal, an echo of that tortoise that walked through the flames, carrying the eagle on its shoulders.